Thank you, everyone, for joining me today to mark International Trans Day of Visibility and celebrate the creativity, the joy, and the resilience of trans people everywhere. My name is Pramila Jayapal. I'm proud to represent Washington's 7th Congressional District in the House of Representatives and also to serve as the co-chair of the Trans Equality Task Force with my friend, the co-chair, also Sarah Jacobs. And we're joined here today by my very good friend, the Equality Caucus Chair, Mark Pocan. I want to thank all of our incredible participants for being with us today and to say what an important moment this is for us to be together and to be lifting up Trans Day of Visibility. Yesterday, I was very proud to reintroduce the Transgender Bill of Rights resolution, along with Representatives Jacobs, Pocan, Cicilline, and Takano, as well as Senator Markey in the United States Senate. As we continue to fight back against the far right's attacks on transgender people, my Trans Bill of Rights lays out a comprehensive policy agenda to empower trans people to live their lives as their authentic selves. This resolution calls for the codification of non-discrimination protections in education, employment, housing, credit, and public accommodations. All the things that we need to make our life work for us. It urges lawmakers to remove barriers to legal recognition on identification and voter registration so that trans people can move freely and confidently through their daily lives. But the work doesn't end there. The Trans Bill of Rights commits Congress to expanding access to life-saving medical care and ensuring that children have affirming learning environments, as well as combating violence against transgender people in all forms. As the very proud mother of an incredible trans daughter, I am deeply disturbed by the rise in anti-trans legislation at all levels of government and at the uptick in transphobic violence. More anti-LGBTQ legislation has been introduced so far this year than in the past 2 years combined. And for the past few years, public figures and lawmakers have been using their platforms to intimidate and dehumanize trans people for simply being themselves. The result is predictable. The number of trans people murdered each year almost doubled between 2017 and 2021, according to Everytown for Gun Safety. And unfortunately, in the first 100 days of this new Congress, House Republicans have prioritized bills that would out LGBTQ kids in schools and impose a national ban on trans youth participating in sports. I am profoundly inspired by the courage and the resilience of transgender people and the ferocity with which they fight, not just for their own liberation, but for justice across many movements for all of us. Since Stonewall and before, trans people have been on the front lines of the battles for LGBTQ rights, as well as for economic and racial justice. Trans people have the right to do more than simply survive. They deserve the opportunity to thrive. The world is a more beautiful place with trans people in it. They are musicians like my daughter, writers and artists, athletes and advocates, scholars and doctors, every profession. Today, I am thrilled to welcome a truly brilliant panel of speakers who will share a broad range of experiences fighting back against anti-trans legislation, expanding access to life-saving healthcare, and just living their lives and contributing to our communities. After we hear from our wonderful panel, we'll turn it over to the audience for questions for any of us on the panel. And if you do have a question for one of us, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window to submit your question at any point during the event. Now, without further ado, it's my honor to hand off the mic to my friend and my fellow co-chair of the Trans Equality Task Force, Representative Sarah Jacobs.
Well, thank you so much, Pramila, for convening us and for everything you do. It is so great to be here with you all today. I know for everyone on this call, including myself, this issue is deeply personal. I am so proud to be the sister of a trans brother and a gender nonconforming sibling, and my siblings have made such a big positive difference in my life. They've inspired me to be braver and more open-minded, and also to recognize my privilege as a cis woman and the role I can play as an ally. Last year, I actually got to officiate my brother's wedding, and it was one of the proudest moments of my life. And it was that very same week that we came back to Congress and voted for the Respect for Marriage Act. And that was particularly meaningful because his existence deserves to be recognized and respected. His marriage deserves to be celebrated, and his life deserves to be protected, just like every other person and every other trans person. And yet, the flood of anti-trans rhetoric, policy, and violence is so heavy for all of us. And I'm so sorry, especially to the trans kids who hear and internalize all this hatred and discrimination coming from my colleagues and from state legislatures across this country. And I want you to know that there are people in Congress who are fighting for you. People like us here on this call. Just this week, I introduced an International Transgender Day of Visibility resolution with Senator Schatz to recognize and celebrate the many contributions and achievements of the transgender community. I've also introduced the Ensuring Military Readiness Not Discrimination Act, which would make sure that military eligibility is based on meeting occupational standards, not who you are. I think it's actually shameful and un-American that some of my colleagues are attempting to deny the trans community's right to serve. And especially when we have a recruiting issue, the fact that 1 in 5 members of the trans community actually serve in the military, and yet my Republican colleagues continue to demonize them instead of celebrating their level of commitment and service to our country. It's sickening. It's sickening. And we know that these issues actually matter. We know that how we talk about this, access to gender-affirming care, these things can be life-saving. And we know that for trans kids across the country, they are at the forefront of what Republicans are trying to do, whether it's kicking them out of playing school sports, whether it's trying to force out them to their parents before they're ready. So we know all of these things, but today I want to make sure we're not only talking about and thinking about the horrible things that our colleagues and Republicans across the country are trying to do, but we also celebrate all of the amazing contributions that the trans community has made to our community. We see you, we hear you, and you are perfect just the way you are. So thank you again for having me today. And now it's my honor to pass it to the chair of the Congressional Equality Caucus, Congressman Mark Pocan.
Thank you, Sarah and Pramila. Thank you so much for putting this together, and both of you for chairing the Trans Equality Task Force. We really appreciate that. The Equality Caucus is, I believe, officially the largest caucus in the Democratic, within the Democratic caucus, 192 members strong. We have nearly every member of the caucus is a part of it. In fact, the few that aren't just don't pay to belong to caucuses. And because we have great professional staff, we ask for a little help on that. But we have members across the country in rural and urban districts who all are very supportive of making sure that every American, especially those in the LGBTQ plus community, are treated with dignity and respect and equality. And today, this is an important day where we are really focusing on trans visibility. The good news is, more than ever, I think people know someone who's trans, and their contributions to society have been certainly laid out, and I think that's very positive. To the negative, though, unfortunately, politicians are somewhat like fish in an aquarium. Some swim on the top, some are on the bottom feeders, so to speak. And that's no different than members of Congress and state legislatures, people who introduce bills to build their brand only to punch down and try to hurt others so that they can raise money and have a profile and do all the things that I think many of us wish would just go away in politics. but that's a reality. And 450 bills have been introduced already in state legislatures across the country. Nearly 20 have become law. We're seeing the same thing in Congress, these bills being introduced, move forward. The very first markup of the Education and Workforce Committee had little to do with education and everything to do with the culture wars that some in the Republican Party really thrive on. And they marked up a ban on trans kids playing in sports. Instead of letting kids just play, they want to try to make a political issue and part of their culture war. That's the reality, what we're seeing out there. The good news is the public gets it. Nearly 8 in 10 people favor LGBTQI plus non-discrimination protections. That's positive going into what we're going to be going into in Congress and state legislatures. But we are going to see these bills introduced, and we're going to fight back hard. But we really appreciate everyone who's here today, all the groups that are working on this and their advocates that you're going to hear from. And again, Pramila, thank you so much. You really have been just an amazing friend and advocate. And I really appreciate having this opportunity this morning. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, I was in that education and labor hearing, and it was painful 14 hours that had nothing to do with education or schools or parents. It is really a privilege to have with us an incredible panel of guest speakers. And before I introduce them, let me remind people, if you missed this at the beginning, that if you have a question for any of our panelists, you can put it in the Q&A chat part of the screen, and we will try to get to as many as we can. If you want to direct your question to a particular speaker, please do. We are really privileged to have with us a remarkable group of people. So first, let me introduce Rodrigo Hang-Leitonen, who is the Executive Director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. He is a transgender policy, advocacy, and messaging expert, and I do mean expert. He is just a remarkable storyteller, a remarkable policy advocate. As a Cuban-American, openly transgender man, his wide-ranging experience in the LGBTQ movement has covered field organizing, leadership development, fundraising, and media advocacy. So we're thrilled to have you with us, Rodrigo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. That is very warm, and happy Transgender Day of Visibility to everyone. I'm so appreciative to Congresswoman Jayapal, Congresswoman Jacobs, Congressman Pocan for your leadership in Congress, and to everyone here today. Again, my name is Rodrigo Hang-Leitonen. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Center for Transgender Equality. Transgender Americans are facing so many attacks today, the likes of which are unprecedented in our community's rich history. This is the reality for many transgender adults, and especially youth in the US, that they perceive lawmakers as trying to create a future where transgender people are pushed to the sidelines. And our communities are shaken now every few weeks by the news that another member of our community has taken their own life as a result, such as Henry Berg Brousseau, Eden Knight, and Kaylee Scott. Here at NCTE, we're tracking more than 430 anti-LGBTQ bills, the majority of which target transgender youth specifically. Many of these bills are part of escalating waves of legislation attempting to restrict or outright ban life-saving transition-related healthcare for trans youth. This is healthcare that has been safely in use and studied already for decades. These bans are now being signed into law in states such as Iowa, Florida, Mississippi, Utah, South Dakota, and Tennessee. The Human Rights Campaign estimates that more than half of transgender youth in the United States have lost or are at risk of losing access to life-saving healthcare right now, essentially forcibly detransitioning tens of thousands of transgender young people, who may then be at increased risk of suicidal thoughts or behavior due to the loss of access to life-saving healthcare. And in states like Oklahoma, Texas, and South Carolina, they're considering banning transition-related healthcare for transgender people up to age 26. Beyond these attacks on our healthcare, we're seeing numerous legislative attempts to prevent transgender people from participating in public life. You can see it in Arkansas, where the governor signed a bill that restricts transgender people from using the right bathroom in schools. You can see it in hostile congressional attempts to erase our experiences and our history from the classroom, such as what we call the Politics Over Parents Act that Representative Pocan mentioned earlier, that hide behind parental rights as a facade for what is really a clear attempt to keep transgender inclusive curriculum from being taught in schools, implying that there is something shameful about being transgender. You can see it in attempts to ban transgender people from participating in sports at the state level, most recently in Wyoming, and even on the federal level, in the form of a bill that would ban transgender girls from playing school sports by revoking the school's federal funding if they simply let a trans girl play on the girls' team. And each year, we continue to see record levels of fatal violence against transgender people, a majority of which target transgender people of color, especially Black transgender women. The attacks on our community are serious, but they are also a sign of our strength. Because the truth is, we are beating many of these bills, and we are uniting in ways they never could have imagined. Each day, we are continuing this fight, and we are building solidarity with the leaders of other social justice movements. We have the support of professional associations and experts, such as the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics. They all stand behind our right to access this life-saving healthcare. And every year, new leaders rise from within our communities to fight these attacks. We're seeing elected officials like the Kentucky governor stand up for trans rights and veto bills that would have enabled government overreach into medical decisions that should stay between patients and their doctors. Over 450 pro-transgender bills have been introduced in 36 states across the country and in Washington, D.C. These bills will allow us to update our legal documents accurately. They will reinforce non-discrimination protections, protect us from the trans panic defense in courts, and much more. We're seeing the right to access life-saving healthcare codified by advocates and lawmakers who are working together to pass bills such as Maryland's Transgender Health Equity Act. And we're seeing members of Congress, like those here today, centering trans voices and the rights of transgender people by fighting for resolutions such as the incredible Transgender Bill of Rights introduced by Representative Jayapal. Together, we are not only fighting these attacks, but from the podium of countless hearings to the pavement beneath the feet of every protester, we are creating a future for trans people worth fighting for. Every year, more trans people step into the light to be celebrated for the gift to the world that we are. So today is in recognition of that and celebration of that. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Rigo. Really appreciate that. Our next speaker is Kaya McCullough. She is an Athlete Ally Ambassador. She is a former professional soccer player, and she is currently studying at Harvard Law School, and we are incredibly grateful that she has had the time to be with us today. She is also the chairwoman of the Anti-Racist Soccer Club, a coalition fighting against racism in the American soccer landscape. Kaya, it is so wonderful to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be sharing space with everybody here. This truly is a great day. Sports changed my life. That sounds super cliche, but in all reality, I don't think I would be where I am today without my sport. I first picked up a soccer ball when I was only 5 years old. At the same time as I was learning my ABCs, I was also learning how to dribble, pass, and score. My parents had a tumultuous divorce around the same time I began playing. For all the instability in my life, soccer was a safe space, a space where I could not worry about the trauma in my life, where I could lose myself in the game and be completely myself at all times. Soccer was my sanctuary, and it remained that way for much of my 17-year playing career. My sport taught me some of the most important lessons of my life from a very young age: how to be a good teammate, how to communicate and collaborate in tough situations, how to work hard, and how to have discipline, how to win with grace, and more importantly, how to fail. Through soccer, I learned to advocate for myself and others, how to be compassionate even when it's not easy, and how to be a servant leader at all times. I forged connections I will carry with me for the rest of my life and gained mentors that guided me through tough times. All this to say, sports are transformative for many people, and sometimes they even save lives. The attack on trans people's rights in our country has led politicians, policymakers, and judges to strip the transformative power of sports away from tens of thousands of people. These attacks have inflicted violence on the lives of those just trying to play the sports they love, and it is so fundamentally wrong. Bills like HR 734 pillage the rights of trans women and girls under the guise of protecting women in sports, although this could not be further from the truth. Actually protecting women in sports looks like providing equal pay between programs, addressing underfunding and discrepancies in media representation and investment, and eradicating mental, emotional, and sexual abuse in all forms. Many media outlets try to portray women's sports teams as wanting trans women and girls off of their teams, when the reality is so much different. Every team I've been on and the leagues I've been a part of cherished our trans teammates and recognize the value they bring to our sport. We must not fall victim to these manipulation tactics at the hands of right-wing politicians. We cannot let hate overwhelm the love that is inherent in sports. Sports should be a space for transformation, growth, and healing for all who need it, and it is our duty to ensure that they remain that way. Though much of my time as an athlete activist have been spent in the racial justice space, organizations like Athlete Ally have encouraged me to fight for what I believe in through an intersectional lens. The intersection of race and gender creates violent and often deadly realities for many trans women of color, both in and out of sport. While at my former club as a professional athlete, I was inspired by activists that came before me to stand up against abuse and racism at the hands of those in power. Their stories fueled me and empowered me with the strength to tell my story. As I continue my journey of advocacy and law, I am guided by the words of activist Fannie Lou Hamer: "Nobody's free until everybody's free." Every trans person deserves to play the sport they love. Every trans person is entitled to the community that comes with sport. Every trans person has the right to be their most authentic self. Until trans folks are afforded the same protections and rights as me, my fight will continue. Yours should too. Thank you for having me. And again, so grateful to be sharing this space with you all.
Wow, so beautiful, Kaya. Thank you so much for sharing part of your journey with us. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kellen Baker, Executive Director of Whitman Walker Institute. The Institute is the research, policy, and education arm of Whitman Walker, a community health system in Washington, D.C. Dr. Baker is an experienced health services researcher, educator, and health policy professional, and we're so delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for having me, and to all of my fellow co-presenters. It's such an honor to be here with you on Trans Day of Visibility. I want to talk a little bit about access to healthcare specifically because it is such an integral part for many trans people of how we live true, authentic, and safe lives. As you heard from Rigo a little bit already, more than 30 states have restricted access to gender-affirming care for trans people or are considering legislation to do so. In many cases, even up until ages around 26, or as we know, pushing those boundaries even further and trying to ban care for transgender adults as well. More than 130 bills have been introduced and 12 states have enacted laws, while at least 3 others have tried administrative action to keep trans people from accessing the care that we need. The Williams Institute estimates that almost 150,000 trans young people have lost access to care or are in jeopardy of losing access to this life-saving service. The ways that these laws go after trans people are many and varied, but they all circle around a couple of different themes. Banning care that is provided by expert medical professionals according to the standards of care, criminalizing providers for working with young people to ensure that they have the healthcare they need, criminalizing parents for supporting their young people, prohibiting referrals, making it impossible to get malpractice insurance, which is a routine administrative necessity for doctors to be able to practice at all, and taking away insurance coverage for gender-affirming care. We've also seen this happening at the federal level with bills such as Marjorie Taylor Greene's recent bill that would prohibit federal funds from paying for any form of gender-affirming care for trans people. Gender-affirming care is individualized and age-appropriate care that is provided according to expert standards that have been in place for decades. As you've heard already, it is recognized as a serious medical need by every major US medical association, and it's provided by licensed medical professionals with individual opportunities for young people to express who they are, what they need, and receive the support of their parents and their providers. The earliest intervention, if you can even call it that, for young people who are transgender is mental health support and social transition, which is completely reversible and just involves listening to young people when they say who they are, what kind of hairstyle or clothing they want to wear, or what name or pronoun fits them best. For adolescents, puberty delay medications are the standard of care. These reversible medications temporarily pause puberty to allow the young person, their parents, and their doctors to ensure that the diagnosis is accurate and to make sure that they're getting the care that they need. Puberty delay medications have been used for both cisgender and transgender adolescents for decades, and they are safe and effective. Older adolescents might transition from puberty delay medications to hormone therapy once a diagnosis of gender dysphoria is confirmed and the child and their parents have consented to further medically necessary treatment. A really robust body of evidence shows that interventions for gender affirmation for trans people at any age are linked to multiple positive health outcomes, including better quality of life, lower rates of mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, a decrease in distress associated with gender dysphoria, and fewer encounters with discrimination. When trans young people have access to the care and support they need, they're able to thrive and have happy, healthy childhoods that set them up for success in life. When politicians are allowed to harass and threaten young people, their parents, and their doctors, this causes real tangible harms. Parents and their children are having to pack up their lives and leave their home states. Doctors are having to choose between providing care according to the oath that they swore to give their patients everything that they need to be healthy and happy. Parents are being threatened with separation from their children simply because they affirm the trans child's right to be who they are. Denying medical care and support for trans young people puts them at risk of serious harms. But research also shows that when families support their trans kids, those kids are much less likely to be depressed and have much better self-esteem and overall health. In an ideal world, decisions about the medical necessity of healthcare services needed by trans young people and trans people at any age would be made by providers, patients, and their families, not by extremist politicians. Politics have no business standing between parents and their children or between patients and their doctors. As Representative Jayapal knows very well, parents of trans children just want to do what's best for their child, and that includes ensuring that their child receives the care and support that they need. The Trans Bill of Rights supports trans people and helps ensure that they can grow up like me. As Representative Jayapal was saying, trans people are everywhere, and we're policy wonks, we're health services researchers, and to have the opportunity to talk with you all today about how we can make sure that every trans person has access to the care and support and protections that they need is such an incredible way to honor Trans Day of Visibility. And I only wish you could see all the way down to the bottom of my shirt, which says, "Trans is beautiful." Thank you.
Trans is beautiful. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kellen, for going into the science and the health of this, because I think a lot of people have questions, and I hope that this town hall is going to get viewed not only by members of Congress, but people across the country who may have some very important questions I think are being answered today. So with that, we are now so fortunate to hear from Emerson Leach, a high school student in Charlotte, North Carolina, and his father, Reverend J. Leach. Emerson is dual enrolled in community college and on track to graduate high school in 2024 with an associate's degree in political science. We're so proud of you and so happy to have you here. Welcome, Emerson and Reverend Leach.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I have been out as trans since 5th grade. I started medically transitioning over 15 months ago on testosterone, and I've seen a drastic improvement in not just my mental health, but my quality in life in general. My peers have been a lot more accepting of me now that I've been medically transitioning, and I'm very happy with the changes that I've seen. One of the things that's most concerning to me about the bills that are being introduced is that access to healthcare may be taken away, not just from me, but from my trans friends and trans youth in general. I am very lucky to have supportive family and friends that I know will fight for me and my access to healthcare, but I'm also aware that is somewhat of a rarity. I think that not only should trans youth have access to healthcare, we should also have access to privacy. It's scary to me that when people are experimenting with pronouns and names with their friends at school, that could be shared, that could be required to be shared by teachers to their parents. I know some of my most formative experiences in the early stages was with my friends, just talking through our experiences and getting to know who we were before having to tell our parents. It really concerns me that that opportunity and that experience may be taken away from other trans youth. I think one of the most common misconceptions is that the knowledge of what being transgender is will then corrupt some youth. And I think I have always experienced gender dysphoria from a very young age. And the only thing that being told about gender dysphoria and being transgender did was give me names to my experiences. It was very helpful to understand what I was experiencing and to have a community that was then able to support me. I was filled with confusion about the way my body was changing and the way that I fit into society. And by having language, it made me feel more accepted. I don't think that if I was cis and had that same information, I would be confused. It was, yeah. Do you have?
As a proud and loving father, and on behalf of my wife, Melissa, I want to thank you, Congresswoman, and your colleagues for your advocacy and for your legislation and for your commitment to this cause. We are proud and loving parents, and that is what we want to be. And I think one of the things, as we heard already, when you want to take away our opportunity in consultation with medical professionals and psychiatric professionals to get the kind of care that is being recommended, if you want to take that away from us, then don't call yourself pro-family. Don't call yourself pro-parent. And by all means, please don't call yourself pro-child. What you are is pro-big government and pro-ideology. We should have the right, in consultation with professionals, as a family, to make the best decisions for our child, the same as anyone else. The other thing I'd like to add quickly is that we should never gather in circles like this with our minds on these issues without acknowledging the intersectional reality that our trans friends of color, our trans friends suffering from poverty, are those who suffer most from the kind of oppression that we are hearing. It feels very important to name them into this space as particular victims of the kind of legislation, oppression, and hatred that we're hearing. Again, we thank you for this opportunity and thank each of you for your advocacy on behalf of our family and all trans families in our country. Thank you.
I think I'm not alone in saying that I have chills and tears from in my eyes from just listening to all of you. Emerson, thank you so much for your powerful, powerful story and words. Reverend Leach, thank you for saying what all of us as parents want for our children. Really deeply appreciate that. So our last, but certainly not least speaker, really somebody who has given hope and inspiration to people across the country, is Delaware State Senator Sarah McBride. Senator McBride represents the 1st State Senate District in Delaware. She is the nation's first openly transgender state senator. I know she will not be our last. And during her tenure, Senator McBride passed the landmark Healthy Delaware Families Act, providing paid family and medical leave to workers throughout the state. Senator, we are so thrilled to have you with us today. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Representative Jayapal, for your leadership, for bringing us together. Thank you to you, Representative Jacobs and Representative Pocan, for not just being here today, but for your vocal advocacy for transgender people across this country. I will say it's always profoundly comforting as a trans person to hear you, Representative Jayapal and Representative Jacobs, talk publicly about your trans loved ones, and how lucky they are to have you as family members, and how lucky you are to have them as family members, and to have the beautiful diversity of trans people within your family. Whenever I'm doom scrolling on social media and watching the latest national Republican attack on trans people, inevitably I will see a video of you or Representative Jacobs talking about the love that you have for your family members. And that is not only comforting for me as a trans person, but it is, I think, transformative for people out there to see people in your positions so publicly display unashamed, unabashed love for trans people. And it helps to open hearts and change minds. So I just want to start by thanking you for that. I am proud to be here today because I'm proud to be transgender. I'm proud to represent my community as my authentic self. And I'm proud of the incredible individuals on this panel and elsewhere who are doing the hard but necessary work of social change, of legal change, and of direct support. I'm proud to be trans because I'm proud to be part of this community. I'm proud of the joy and vibrancy we bring to our states and to this country. We are better off as Americans because we have out and proud trans people in our communities. And today is Transgender Day of Visibility, a day where we celebrate that beauty and that vibrancy. But as the previous speakers have demonstrated, it is a bittersweet Transgender Day of Visibility, because in this moment, we are facing an unprecedented attack on transgender people throughout this country. An unprecedented attack that manifests as discrimination and hate and violence on a day-to-day basis, and an unprecedented attack that unfortunately manifests in politicians utilizing transgender people as political footballs. And what is so unconscionable about that effort is that these adults, so-called political adults, have chosen to bully trans kids. They've chosen to focus in on some of the most vulnerable but vibrant members of our community. And we've heard about the range of these attacks, from legislation that's seeking to strip trans kids away from their families, legislation that is seeking to bar medically necessary healthcare, bills that want to keep trans kids from participating in extracurricular programs, and laws that try to censor any mention of the reality of LGBTQ people within our schools. And while each of these individual bills and proposals have dangerous consequences in reinforcing stigma and putting a target on young people's backs and families' backs for discrimination, taken together, the through line of all of those bills is to strip away any layer of support that a trans young person might have. Parents, providers, educators, classmates, teammates, coaches, neighbors, and friends, to leave trans kids feeling isolated, to leave them feeling so alone that they lose hope. And the consequence of these political attacks, this isn't an abstract conversation. The consequence of these political attacks is to make life so difficult for these young people that some never grow up to be adults. We have to be clear about what the stakes are. We have to be clear about what the consequences of this cruel and concerted effort are. But despite the challenges that we are facing, I have never been more hopeful. Today is Transgender Day of Visibility, and it is a day, yes, to recognize the challenges we face, yes, to acknowledge the fears and the barriers that trans people face, but also to recognize that trans people are people with hopes and dreams, with joy and love and laughter, just like everyone else. And that all of those different characteristics, all of that joy and love and authenticity, it enriches not only our own community, but our world. And it has never been more important for us to not just commemorate this day, but to find and summon that trans joy. And I think that's true for so many different reasons. One, it's true because we are people who are worthy of joy. We are people who are capable of joy, and we are people who feel joy. Two, because trans joy is the greatest contrast and the greatest argument against the attacks that we're facing. So often the rationale, the disinformation and misinformation that anti-trans politicians use to justify the very bills that we've talked about is a disingenuous concern trolling, an effort to try to pretend like they're protecting transgender people from themselves, from this fear and risk that they presume must come with allowing trans people to live authentically. As Dr. Baker has made very clear, we know that when trans people are allowed to live authentically and embraced by their community, they report positive, and in many cases, the exact same mental and physical health outcomes as their non-transgender peers. So when we persist in our trans joy, when we demonstrate and live out loud our trans joy, we are a walking personification of the fact that allowing trans people to live openly and be embraced by our community is good for them and good for their families and good for society. That trans joy is an inherent and necessary contrast to the disinformation and misinformation that these anti-trans politicians are putting out there. Trans joy is the greatest argument against these bills. And then finally, the reason why it has never been more important for us to summon that trans joy is because the moment we lose that joy, the moment we lose our hope is the moment that they win. We need that joy and that hope to persist. And there are reasons for joy and hope. We have seen it on this panel, trans people throughout daily life, in advocacy, in healthcare, in athletics, in our schools, who are living openly. The growing ranks of transgender people who, because of the change that we have brought collectively as a community and as a country, are now able to live a life that just decades ago would have seemed so impossible that it was almost incomprehensible. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in the advocacy work that I did prior to getting elected. I see it now in the fact that I get to represent a community that I was born and raised in as an out transgender woman. I see it in the transgender people who are succeeding in business and the arts, in healthcare, in government. I see it every single day. We see it in the positive legislation that has been passed, including most recently in the state of Michigan, where they, after a decades-long fight, have finally clearly and explicitly added sexual orientation and gender identity to their state's non-discrimination laws. We have reason and reasons for hope. And also, even in this moment, as we face the challenges, what I am reminded of is that at every step in the movement for LGBTQ equality, once politicians put their targets on a particular part of the community, once they decide to weaponize a particular issue, we end up having conversations with our classmates and our colleagues, with our friends and our family members, with our neighbors and our community members that sow the seeds of the destruction of the politics of hate that those anti-trans politicians, anti-LGBTQ politicians seek to implement. Once they start coming for us, they start the clock on the effectiveness of their anti-LGBTQ policies and attacks. Every time they come for us, we end up growing stronger. And I am confident that if we summon that joy, if we summon that hope, in the end, we'll find the light. And I look forward to working with all of the individuals on this panel and so many others to find that light, to find that joy, to summon that joy, and to finally deliver true justice and equality for the entirety of our community.
So incredible. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Trans joy is such a beautiful invocation for us this morning. And I want to thank you for the clarity and conscience of your leadership. So we have time, a little time for some questions. We already have some questions in the Q&A, and so I will read them out and direct them over to people. But if you do have other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. It can be for any of our panelists. You can identify who you'd like your question to go to. And our first question, I'm going to ask Mark and Sarah to start off on this one. It is from somebody who, sorry, let me just pull it up here. It is from somebody who would like to know, with regard to, no, sorry, that was the one for Sarah. Let me go back. Here it is. As GOP legislatures across the country legislate trans people out of existence while conflating drag queens with transgender women, how can congressional Democrats combat the attack on this community?
Well, I think a few things. I think the first is talking about it, normalizing using our pronouns, normalizing how we talk about our trans family members and trans people we know. I have to do this a lot on the Armed Services Committee, where some of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle are trying to use inflammatory language around Drag Queen Story Hour and trans healthcare. So part of it is just speaking up and making sure that you are humanizing people and not giving in to the sort of rhetoric that the other side is using. But I think another piece of it is legislative, right? We know we need to pass laws that are going to protect trans people across this country so that you don't have to live in California or Washington state to be protected, that you can be protected around the country. And that's something that Pramila and I, as co-chairs of the Trans Equality Task Force, are working on to try and make sure we have all of the legislation we need to be able to protect people, and then work to build the coalition to try and actually get it passed.
Thank you, Sarah. Mark?
Sure. I would just add, I mean, one, I think it's great that we have positive legislation introduced yesterday to move things forward. At the same time, we have these attacks going on. The good news is within the Democratic caucus, I think we are a very unified caucus when it comes to equality. In fact, when the politics over parents bill, the so-called parental bill of rights by Republicans was on the floor, Lauren Boebert added some amendments that banned trans kids from playing in sports. They also have separate legislation that was marked up in committee. Every single Democrat voted against the politics over parents bill. So we already have a record of that. And our leadership with Hakeem Jeffries, he is very focused on making sure that we're protecting that. So just this week, they had us talking to all the ranking Democratic members of committees to make sure we're looking out for language around non-discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. We had a 10-minute conversation in the WIPS meeting, including showing Rebecca Briesehoff's video that HRC has put together, which I think is a great video. And we're ready for the fight. We're going to be there to protect people.
That's wonderful. And maybe I'll summarize what both of you said and say, to me, it's four things. Humanize, as Sarah said, with our stories, educate because a lot of people don't understand these issues. That's why we wanted this to be very substantive in terms of the information about what it means to be a transgender person. What does it mean to transition? What are these, what is the regimen? What kind of mental health support do people get? All of those things are really important. So educate. Third one is organize. I'm an organizer. I believe things happen because movements help to make them happen. That's the organizing that happens across the country. And then, of course, legislating, which is what we have to do in states and the country. So thank you so much for that. Sarah, I'm going to ask the next one to you, because it's a question about whether it is, with all these state bills that are happening and public hearings that are happening in state legislatures across the country, our questioner says, with regard to fighting queer-phobic bills, what are the pluses and minuses of testifying at a public hearing? Oh, yeah.
I wasn't sure which Sarah you were talking about.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Sarah McBride. Yes, yes, I forgot. There's two Sarahs. Whoops. Sarah McBride.
What I would say is that I think there are only positives in terms of having our voices and stories heard. I will say that obviously, if you don't feel safe and comfortable sharing your story publicly, that's okay. That's okay. There are certainly ways to push back without doing it publicly. But when we have trans people and allies testifying before legislative committees, making it clear that these bills have real consequences, that people oppose these bills, and to utilize those moments as opportunities to educate the committee members, but also the public that are watching, I don't think we should pass that up. I will say one of the joys of this moment is that we are seeing now, instead of those committee daises just being at best allies and at worst filled with opponents, we are now seeing trans people sitting in those committee rooms in state legislatures across the country. We had an anti-trans bill that was referred to my committee that I actually chair in the Delaware State Senate. And for decades, people like me had to go before anti-trans lawmakers in the big chair. And now anti-trans advocates have to come before a trans person in the big chair and look at us and plead for our right and defend their bigotry. And so when I see trans people sharing their stories in legislative committees, you also make it harder for those elected officials to discriminate.
It's exactly right. Exactly right. Bringing those stories in. I think it's why Sarah and I often bring our family stories, and always with, I know I'm always checking with my daughter to make sure that that's okay and that that's something that she wants. But I think it is important to make it difficult for people to talk about the transgender community in the way that sometimes they do. Okay, the next one is just a quick one for me, so I'll take it. And it is, what prospect do we have of passing your bill? It was introduced last session. And what I will say is that this time we introduced it with 104 co-sponsors. And that's a pretty huge number. As you heard Mark Pocan say, the Equality Caucus is the largest caucus in the House. My hope is that we can work with all of you out there to, and with, our colleagues, to get as many co-sponsors on the bill as possible, because it is a resolution that really articulates the wide vision of what we need to have transgender people have the same rights as the rest of us. And so I think it is really an important resolution, and we'll work very hard. Obviously, we don't control the House this year, so passing it is probably not an option, but building the support for it is, so that when we take back the House in 2 years, we can pass it then. Our last question is actually for Emerson and for Dr. And for Reverend Leach. And I'm sorry, Caius, could you forward that to me again? It went away here. Okay, we'll go to this one for Dr. Baker instead. Here, Dr. Baker, trans kids and their families are really struggling in states where gender affirming care is being outlawed. What do you say to families who are looking to move out of their GOP-led states to seek the health care that they need?
My heart really just breaks for parents and young people who are having to face this decision of having to leave the state that they call home, having to uproot themselves from schools, leave jobs, and move across state lines in order to be safe from extremist politicians who are looking to score political points. There are increasingly a number of efforts afoot in the country to ensure that there's information and, to whatever degree possible, some resources to help defray the costs and the challenges of having to deal with this question of, do you have to pick up and leave the state that you're living in? And at the same time, it's a really heartbreaking, not just because of the experience of families who are moving, but especially the experiences of families who can't move. And that is an economic justice issue. It is a racial justice issue. This degree to which so many of these states are trapping people because of circumstances like low wages or the difficulty of accessing health insurance coverage, period, for anything, even without, even beyond access to gender affirming care. So I really applaud the states that are doing the work to create these safe havens for people who are able and feel like they need to leave their home states because of attacks from extremist far-right politicians. But I really think it's critical for us to continue to support and fight on the ground in every single state, so that every young person, regardless of whether their families have the means or the ability to pick up stakes and seek refuge elsewhere, that every trans young person has access to the care that they need, and so that that care doesn't depend on their zip code.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker. And our last question, I'm going to direct it to Emerson, Reverend Leach, as well as Rodrigo and Kaya, because I think you can all speak to this. What advice do you have for trans kids and for their parents? And we'll start with you, Emerson and Reverend Leach.
I think for me, it's really just about community, seek out like-minded people. And I think it also has to do with people that push you down, that don't support you being trans. It's not good to be around them. And as much as like you might not want to cut people off, it really just makes you feel bad knowing people don't support you. And just people around the world are behind you. There's a community for you. And yeah.
Reverend Leach, you want to add anything? Or Kaya, go ahead.
I was just going to say, continue to have joy. I was very moved by many of the words here. Continue to have joy. There are people on the ground fighting for you who want your rights to be solidified and codified. So keep having joy and keep being yourselves, because you are cherished and loved.
Beautiful.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I would just add to Emerson's point about finding community, reach out and do your research on local trans organizations, because there are trans groups all around the country, including in rural areas, including in red states. There are trans people everywhere. So don't give up hope that you're the only one, or that thinking that you're the only one out there. Reach out for resources, connect with other trans people and families. I guarantee you there is someone else. So don't go through this alone. Reach out and find your people.
Well, what a beautiful way to close this town hall. I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Pocan and Representative Jacobs. I want to thank Senator McBride, and I want to thank our phenomenal panelists today for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your stories, for sharing your trans joy, for sharing the motivation for the entire country to continue to fight and win the hearts, the minds of families everywhere across the country. This is not a partisan issue. When you look at where people actually are on the issue, there might be legislators making it partisan in Congress, but let me tell you that I think we all understand what it means to be ourselves, and we should want that for every single person. We have incredible challenges, there's no question. But as Sarah, as Rigo, and others pointed out, we are also winning in a lot of spaces. And I was struck by Senator McBride's description of this moment when things focus on a particular issue. I think of it as an organizer as that moment of disruption and eruption that clarifies where we must be and what we have to do to get there. So strength comes in times of organizing. Thank you all so much for the work you're doing on the ground. Thank you for being a part of this joyful and loving movement for transgender rights. And it has been such a pleasure, as Kaya said, to share space. So thank you all. Happy Trans Day of Visibility.